Welcome back to Operation RCT for the recap of Imperial Japan. So the war was called with an Allied victory, and we sort of got to a point in the game where it became sort of highly unlikely that the Axis had an opportunity to sort of overtake the victory points that were collected by the Allies. So we decided to call it there. So my strategy for Imperial Japan, when I first started off, I developed an extra factory to give myself that extra tech role in the homeland there, and I thought, well, I did think about it. The obvious tech to go for is amphibious doctrine as Japan, because obviously it's an island hopping nation. It's heavy navy focus, and I thought, ultimately at the end of the day, Japan tends to be overrun potentially by the FEC or the British Navy, and in combination, obviously, with the US Navy, becomes the big beast that usually comes along and does the job. So I thought, well, how can I get around that? So I thought, well, you can still island hop with air transports and airborne. So I sort of started to develop that doctrine. At the same time, I was obviously going for probably the most important one for Japan, which is improved construction. And it just took forever to actually finally land. That was a bit of a problem because it was much later. I can't remember which turn it was that I hit it, but it was a lot later in the game than what I was hoping for. There were some other doctrines that we sort of, we went for factories, which we never really got to capitalize on because at the end of the day, that was late game that we sort of developed that. We eventually hit large ships, which is what we needed as well. So there's two key techs that are kind of non-negotiable that I think are, large ships and improved construction, so that you can get that slight discount on the naval units and try and force the US to fight for that sort of big blue fleet. And so, they've got to get double the amount of capital ships that you've got to get. But for you to get Kitabatai, you need to get more than them. So it's a tricky one to sort of negotiate. I went for those three factories right at the start of the game, and that was a strategy from there. It was like a tech strategy, because I think 2 dice I just don't think is enough for Japan, and I think that kind of puts you behind the 8 ball and limits opportunities for you as the game sort of progresses. So at the start of the game, we went into China, and we sort of marched into China quite unopposed. And so KMT pulled out of Nanking, Hunan, and Shantung. So there was a bit of a bloodless sort of invasion, and we were able to sort of capitalize on the money in that region and those bonus dollars or IPPs that we got as a sort of in the early part of the war. Where we made a very big tactical mistake was not taking out Kwangtung. So I did a deal with the devil there with Bruce, and he was telling me he was going to withdraw in 1940 out of Kwangtung, and that was never going to happen. And so I just saw more and more units pile into there, and it being a mountainous territory, it became more and more difficult as he started to pile in AAA guns and whatnot. So, there's probably a limited window for Japan to act on Kwangtung, and I would suggest in the future, Kwangtung is a critical territory to take as Japan and to hold. It's a really important territory. In a lot of ways, it sort of is a bit of a can opener for the southern part of China, as well as the sort of peninsula here into Southeast Asia, where obviously you've got one of your strategic objectives in taking Burma, Siam, Cochin China, Anam Tonkin, and Malaya. So went for the Dowdell government. That backfired. I gave that a couple of goes, and in the end, that sort of ended up giving the CCP an early leg up. The CCP received a lot of heavy lend-lease in the game, and made for a strong CCP and perhaps a weaker Russia. However, it did force me as the Axis player to pile in a lot more units into China. So I ended up with two sort of main forces that were building up. One in Nanking, as obviously I wanted to hold that as a strategic objective. And two, I sort of sat in Syria, one, because it sort of kept the CCP away from Manchuria and protecting that part of the board. And at the same time, it sort of, in mountains, I didn't need as many units to be able to defend in theory. So I did watch them build up quite a bit, and then that sort of became concerning because that CCP army was quite formidable towards the end of the game. And it's probably a high likelihood if we kept playing that the CCP would have evolved. The KMT, because the KMT and the CCP never really engaged, and the KMT sort of turtled up there for quite a while before they sort of came forward. Again, they grew into be quite a powerful force with a lot of AAA and a lot of artillery, and even a lot of infantry. So they were quite a formidable army, and there's no way that I could have spent enough money in that region. Eventually, I was going to, stuck between a rock and a hard place between the CCP and the KMT. So, I held them at bay to a point, and I thought one of my strategies, sort of in the midpoint, was to sort of go into Russia and go into Mongolia to sort of, get them moving around a bit and just create a bit of extra pressure and maybe draw some resources away from the Eastern Front where they were fighting, the Russians are fighting the Germans. So I wanted to sort of do that, and sort of, that's why I bombed the factory in Novosibirsk as well, just to create a bit more pressure on Silk, on the Russian player, and assist my ally there. When we went down into, Malaya, and we started to threaten Calcutta, I left it too late. So to the point where I lost my opportunity to conduct a surprise attack. And to Global War Enthusiast's credit, he stacked Calcutta with a lot of AAA, and it made it very unpalatable for me to go in there with my planes. And I wanted to preserve my Air Force and Navy as long as possible, just to create that presence in the Pacific. And also, the greater the presence in the Pacific region that I have, the more it's going to draw the U.S. Navy. So it's to try and draw as much of the U.S. fleet away from the Atlantic, so that the U-boats can sort of have at it in there, which they did. And the Germans with Hambone really, played a stellar game in the Atlantic, and the Atlantic really was probably a bit of a nightmare for the British, for Global War Enthusiasts, and it really did create an issue and a headache for him throughout the game. However, going back to this region in here and Calcutta proper, we lost the opportunity to strike there. And so when I eventually moved on the Philippines, on Southeast Asia, and into Dutch East Indies, it was kind of too late. So I should have moved maybe a turn earlier. I did make a very critical mistake here, and that's on me. And my ally did warn me about this, and I moved troops into southern India, thinking that the river and maybe, the mountains there, partial mountains in there, might assist me somewhat. And I lost a lot of troops in there, and they just didn't. They didn't defend well against the attack there that came out of Calcutta, and they got annihilated pretty badly. I lost some stuff in Aden. So at one point, we were kind of looking at sizing up a number of targets when I did do that strike. So when I did move on the Dutch East Indies, Hambone and I were considering attacks on Lower Egypt. We were considering attacks on landing troops in Madagascar and perhaps even Cape Town, and really getting into Africa somewhat and maybe destabilizing We never really gave Australia a thought, or the Anzacs, because, the way I saw it, there was no ability to project power out of there. There was no Navy that was threatening me, and, they want to build up troops in Australia, great. They were no threat to me. He needs a Navy to move them and project them. Towards the end of the game, there was some airborne and air transport, but, by then it's kind of, it was all she wrote. So that there was some attacks that, were risky, and they just didn't pay off for us. So taking Aden cost us some Navy, cost us some fighters and some Marines for not much benefit. So that one, in hindsight, stretched us out a little bit, and we lost stuff there. I think also, from memory, I lost maybe some cruisers and destroyers, maybe in around southern Iran, in that I-6 zone there. From memory, I think I had some stuff in there that I might have landed in Maharashtra at one point. I think I might have had one Marine that survived that assault, and then they got taken out, and that fleet got taken out. So that was not good as well. And I think as a Japanese player, you just have to be so conservative with your Navy. You can't afford to just throw ships away. That you got the British Navy breathing down your throat that can come through the Med at any time. You got the US fleet slowly building. And the other thing I kind of was torn between was a surprise attack on Hawaii. I'd love to be able to do that. I think that would be cool. It's obviously historical. But, I was too out of position for that, and it just didn't seem tenable. So that never really took off. So we went with we built Marines, we built airborne, we built air transports. We did invest in the Navy once we hit large ships. My theory sort of towards the latter part of the game, in buying a lot of destroyers and smaller ships and having those heavy cruisers towards the end, was I was hoping to bait the US fleet out of Wake, because the way I saw their fleet, even though they're substantially bigger, they're all capital ships. So if there was some way that I could maybe, towards the end of the game, keep a couple of heavy battleships in port, maybe send that fleet forward, sacrifice it, and damage towards the end of the game, damage as many of those battleships as I could, they're then not going to count for the big blue fleet. And bearing in mind, he's got to have double the capital ships that I have. So that was kind of my late game strategy in terms of my Navy. I tried to keep the Navy together. Hambone came up with a sort of ingenious plan of putting pressure on them in Guam, and so I sent these troops forward to invade into Guam, and they did that. I didn't see what happened to them on Bruce's turn. I can only imagine they got annihilated. And then we were sending a force up here to Atu Kiska to try and see if we can interrupt that victory point for the US, and sort of just draw that US Navy out of Wake somehow. The problem with Japan is we really were a paper tiger throughout the game. Even though at some points we did grow to, a half reasonable income. I mean, it wasn't, it's certainly not the biggest income, but it was a reasonable income. At one point we were bringing in a decent amount of money. However, we were really soft in protecting Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. We really didn't have a lot down there. We got pushed out of there by that army that marched south out of Calcutta, and they basically ran through us like a hot knife through butter. And in the end, in British Malaya, that was lost to the FEC pretty easily. Even though we put a fortification in there, we did, and I know we did take out some units, but really there wasn't enough left to defend. And I did abandon that. It became a bit of a lost cause once the US sort of came in, took the Philippines, and really started to get a lot closer. I never got the opportunity to use my kamikazes. I was a little sad about that, to be honest. It would have been good. What could I have done differently in hindsight? I certainly would have maintained my presence in Russia. I wouldn't have withdrawn out of that, and that was a bit of a deal with the devil again with the CCP. and that kind of backfired on me. Would I have got pushed out of there? Yeah, probably, but I would have made it a lot more difficult. I would have stayed in and built up in Primorsky Kryamur and made him come out of Cheetah and maybe take those territories back a little more difficult, and that might have helped out my ally on the Eastern Front. Just maybe, I think the Russians really had a hard time of it. I think what really made their lives difficult was the amount of bombing that took place. I think that was a really pretty successful strategy from Germany, and I think it really made it difficult for him to produce anything that could project forward. There was a lot of infantry on in the Russian army and a lot of militia, but nothing that really could push forward. There was some stuff obviously towards late game that was heading towards Calcutta. Some T-34s and some advanced mechs that were starting to head that way. But I think in the midpoint of the game, Germany was able to sort of keep them out of Poland quite well and damage a lot of factories and really create a bit of a nightmare for poor old Silk. However, Silk did play the CCP very well and made it a really interesting three-way battle in there. It was a real build-up in China. You started growing these armies that were just, you just looked at them and you're like, well, there's no way I'm going to be attacking that thing. And it's just going to annihilate me. So, late game we took Shenxi, but, no big deal. It was a small force in there and that cost us a lot. But, by then the game was pretty much decided and Shenxi is not, no big deal. I was in the process of trying to maybe stopping them evolve and take a few of these territories in here if the game had continued. And that was the sort of concept behind that, because he would have had to chase me out of Rihe. And that force was never going to be able to catch me there. But eventually that force there would have punched itself out and probably run out of troops. But who knows what would have happened if that kept going. I think we, as a Japanese player, did a reasonable job of keeping the KMT from, although they had a massive army, they weren't really able to push us out of China or anything along those lines. And obviously that's a real difficult task as the KMT anyway. There's too many retreats, and the KMT didn't get a lot of assistance out of the CCP because they had their own goals in mind and were building up to be a bit of a beast. Extrapolate China out a whole bunch of turns, and I probably have no doubt that the CCP ends up all over the place in there. So, very interesting game. There's a lot of things that I in hindsight, it's obviously 2020 and fantastic, but at the end of the day, it was a lot of fun. You learn a lot out of playing these games and different strategies, and you kind of think, well, I might try something different for the next game. And I think that's the beauty of Global War 36. It really is 4D chess. It really is. There's so many different aspects and strategies and, all sorts of, backroom deals you can do potentially with your enemies. But I would be cautious about that in the future. But that's part of the game. That is part of the game, and maybe I was a little naive there, but, and well played to everyone in this game. I think probably my ally in Hambone really is a bit of a genius at misdirection, and he really was able to do some interesting stuff in Africa. It got quite interesting there. North Africa became a real battle zone there with the Africa Corps. But again, Pete, Global War enthusiast, to his credit, he really protected, Calcutta, those real critical areas, Lower Egypt. He was masterful at maneuvering the Royal Navy around in the Med and getting things to Gibraltar and fortifying Gibraltar. And that was really under no threat, I don't think. Hambo might say something different. But, he did well too in keeping Cape Town safe and pushing, the Italians out of Abyssinia and getting that victory point. Well, I don't know if that was taken on the Italian turn. I doubt it was. So yeah, overall, a really interesting game. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the next one. I just want to thank my fellow players, and thanks to all the viewers that sort of watched and made comments. I appreciate those as well. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.